All right, yeah. Thanks for coming out, everyone. All right, show of hands who have used WebPageTest before.
Show who didn't.
A lot of us, that's awesome. I'm going to introduce it as if it's new, just because it kind of gives us context into what has changed recently. So if it's new to you, that's fine. Are we developers, performance engineers, developers? Do you do performance audits? Designers? Designers too, Charlie? Yeah, okay, nice. All right, cool. Part of the recent effort with WebPageTest is we're trying to make it more inclusive to different roles on the team. Traditionally, it's been around a while, like a decade. And it's a power tool, right? And I think early on, it was very geared towards developers, like most of us in the room, performance engineers. We're trying to better support that type of role while making some of the tools a little more easy to understand and use for different roles on the team. So you'll see some of that exposed in different ways in the results that you see on WebPageTest recently. So this is, for those of you who haven't been before, webpagetest.org. This is the homepage. It also serves as the starting point for using the app, so to speak. It's a web app. If you scroll down, this is where you start interacting with the tool. There are a number of different kinds of tests. The default is a sort of a overall diagnostic performance kind of test. There are also more specific subsets of that where you could test just Core Web Vitals, Lighthouse, actually run the Lighthouse tool that Google produces from WebPageTest. We also have visual comparisons where you can go place multiple URLs and get a head-to-head sort of visual comparison of performance of different sites, and then trace route to be able to see how your site loads from origin to the endpoint. So from there, you would enter a URL here, and then you could either choose from several of our presets here. We've got mobile, desktop, different configurations. One thing that's really cool about WebPageTest, and I think that sort of makes it unique amongst other tools that are similar to it, is that it works across different kinds of browsers and devices. So we have, to start, some configurations like Chrome on mobile from Virginia and a desktop alternative as well. But then we have different locations around the world. This one's from Mumbai, a 3G connection speed, also on Chrome on a mobile device. And then we have different browsers, Firefox, Edge. So these are actually giving you the option of testing in those browsers. If you go to the advanced configurations, there are even more different kinds, even like Safari, iOS testing, things like that. So advanced also gives you lots of different configurations and options that I'm not going to be able to go through today. But if you were to put a URL in, hit start test here, this is typically what you would see. Recently, we've been redesigning things a little bit throughout the last year. This is a test result page, and if you've been to it in the last year, you'd probably find this section most familiar. These are the metrics, right? Where there's a lot of overlap with different tools. Lighthouse shows a lot of these same metrics. If you're familiar with Lighthouse, got time to first byte, start render, when pixels start to paint to the screen, first contentful paint, when useful pixels and content paint to the screen. We've got speed index, which is sort of a calculated impression of how the page loaded. That's a long time WebPageTest metric that started with WebPageTest. Largest contentful paint, when the largest section of content renders to the page. Here it's shown in red. This is a Airbnb result. Anyone from Airbnb here? It would have been fun if someone was, but this test was on Airbnb.com, and as you can see, it's a desktop view. So you saw the LCP metric in red here. that's color coded for, if it was green, according to Core Web Vitals, it would have been under 2.5 seconds, something like that. If it was orange, it would be somewhere between that and this red zone at 8 seconds. So that right away gives you a glance at, okay, maybe that's a metric that I need to look at. Recently, we've added the film strip here, which can take you through to this classic view, which is, I think, one of my favorite ways to use WebPageTest is to actually look at the keyframes of how a page visually loads. And I think this one was pretty interesting because, metrics tell you so much, right? Like first contentful paint happened pretty early with this site, 2.5 seconds. But, it's kind of just gray boxes. It's not really useful content. And that's sort of one of those patterns that we see with a lot of client-side heavy loading patterns where, you might load a skeleton page of gray boxes, sort of hint at what's to come, but then fetch more content, and you're not really getting content for a little while. In this case, Airbnb is showing images much later, 8 seconds or so. That'll be a good case to try to optimize with some of the new tools that we've released recently. So to get into that, I wanted to first talk about this fake news site that we built called The Metric Times. And it's on webpagetest.org/The Metric Times if you want to check it out. This page was built to purposefully fail every diagnostic that we could throw at it. It's terrible anti-patterns, right? All built into the same page, images that are really highly unoptimized, loading all of React on a CDN just to put that piece of text in, and lots of, dad jokes throughout. So what's nice about this is it serves as kind of a unit test of sorts, vaguely anyway, to run through WebPageTest and demos really well how well our new feature called Opportunities and Experiments is working. So I ran a test of the metric times earlier today, and I queued these up just because it takes a little while to run a test, and I didn't want to just be looking at a loading screen. So this was a run through on desktop, cable connection, the metric times. And you can see some metrics are a little higher. Typically, we have the worst scores on a mobile device if I had run a mobile test. And if you look at this section here, this is kind of new within the last month and a half when we released a new feature called Opportunities and Experiments. So these are 3 broad categories of opportunities, basically diagnostic tests that we run on the page that can either result in a pat on the back that things look okay, or a potential opportunity to improve, or at least take a look. Maybe there's a bottleneck here that you want to know about, or maybe things are okay. We kind of leave it to the person that's testing the site to make the final call on that. But these are some sort of summaries of what you'll get if you go to that section. So it's broken into a few categories: quickness, usability, and resilience. And each of those have a number of diagnostics that are run. So if I go to the Opportunities and Experiments page from here, you can see those same 3 categories broken down as you scroll down this page. And again, the diagnostic tests that go with them. And since I ran a desktop test, this one actually passed. That shouldn't have happened. I should have used a slower connection speed or something like that. But the second one here is a bottleneck that presents an opportunity. So in this case, it found 6 JavaScript files that were referenced in such a way that they caused the browser to stop rendering the page until it could fetch all of those scripts and then proceed once it evaluated and parsed those scripts. Sort of the default way that you would load a script if you didn't choose to do it in parallel on purpose, right? So it's saying all of these are blocking rendering. And what's particularly nice about this new feature set, I think, is that along with these opportunities, we usually, we try to elevate either a tip or an experiment that you can run to see if you can make an optimization that actually changes or improves upon this particular problem that we encountered. So experiments come as part of WebPageTest Pro for the most part. So that's sort of our first paid offering through the web UI of WebPageTest. Some experiments, such as this first one, if it's recommended to you, are free to run, while the rest require a pro account. So if you have a site that you ran and you have a free WebPageTest account, you can try this experiment. Any experiment that you want to run is just check a box, and it's a no-code sort of situation. In this case, there were these 6 scripts that are blocking, and if I spin this open here, it'll allow me to choose if I want to defer one or more of these. But still, it's recommending something in a sort of reactive way, right? Like it's not a very manual process to run this experiment. It kind of sets it up for you. So if I just wanted to run that one, I would check that box, move my zoom bar here to see the box. And then down here, we have kind of like a little add to cart experience where it says the experiments that are selected. It looks like I had another one from earlier. And these jump to scroll to them. So whenever I have the one or more that I want to run, I can hit go and rerun the test. Now, what happens when I rerun this test as an experiment is it'll actually run two tests of this site through a proxy that we have that actually makes changes to the code base on the fly. And this, from a technical perspective, uses edge functions on Netlify. So kind of like a JavaScript service worker that fetches different types of text files, for example, or images, but say it's the initial HTML, it passes through this proxy, makes a little change on the way, and carries it on to the browser to test it as WebPageTest would ordinarily. For every experiment, we run a control run also that goes through that proxy but doesn't change anything. And that way, we can be a little more confident that we're comparing fairly, because just passing anything through that proxy tends to affect the performance a little bit. It actually tends to speed up a lot of sites because the edge functions are hosted on CDN locations all over the place. And if the site that you're testing is located in one place, maybe on the other side of the world, those functions are just more efficient at delivering it to the end device. So to get that fair comparison, we do the control run and the experiment run. This is what a result looks like after you run an experiment. So up top, we've got a video head to head. This is the experiment, and this is the control. So unchanged experience versus the one that I ran. In this case, I added, so there was a opportunity for layout shifts, and it said that some images were missing aspect ratios. And what that means from a coding perspective is we can now add width and height back to those image elements in the page and tell the browser to reserve a little room for where that image will be whenever it starts to load. If you don't do that, you get sometimes, like say there's text following an image, it'll be collapsed and then the image starts to load and the text shifts down. It's really not nice for the user experience. So in this case, we see that some metrics were negligible difference, but CLS here, the layout shift was a little bit better, and it was minor. In the problem was kind of minor in the first place, but we can see it. Maybe I could show a better. If you scroll down, yeah, you can see the head-to-head. This is the film strip experiment run versus the control. And in maybe I can make these, if I go into the settings, I can go to huge image size. That'll help a little bit. In our control run, you can see here that this text here comes after an image. And then here you can see that there's space reserved, right? So we know the experiment worked. And CLS was improved as a result. So that was a cool, successful experiment, even though it's a small change. If it's an improvement for the better, it'll be green. If it's a degradation, it'll be red. Both are useful to know. And both are huge time savers, right? Like just doing these, manually. I used to work as a consultant before I joined here 9 months ago. And we used to do performance audits, and we would write service workers that would make these modifications on edge functions by hand. And just doing like this one experiment would take a day or two to make sure we got it right, especially if we hadn't written the code for that before. So it's a huge time saver to be able to run these and try different things. Okay, so let's see that. Oh, okay, and this was a result of that same metric times with deferring JavaScript. So I had my tabs mixed up, but this result showed first contentful paint was a second faster just by freeing up those scripts to allow the page to render sooner on 3G connection. So, a small improvement. I would have expected a little more on 3G, but it's interesting to know. So I wanted to go back to that Airbnb result to demonstrate some different experiments that I think are pretty neat. So again, this is the homepage, airbnb.com. And going back to that test result, I was going to jump to the opportunities page. And as you remember, we had that gray boxes experience, right? So it said that LCP was really late, like 8 seconds. But when we looked at the timeline, it wasn't a classic LCP optimization sort of opportunity. And those are usually like, you've got a big hero image. Maybe you should preload that image, right? To get it to arrive sooner, or add a new priority hint to that image. But in this case, it wasn't necessarily that we wanted the image to be discovered sooner. We wanted just content in general to be given to the browser sooner, because it was all generated by JavaScript much later. So those images weren't even in the page for a while. So there's an opportunity at the bottom of quickness category that deals with this exact scenario for client-side rendered sites. And I'm sorry if the text is a little small there, but I'll read it to you. So this one says a significant portion of HTML content, 300 kilobytes in this case, so 20% of the page, if you compare initial delivery to the end state, was generated after it was delivered to the browser. So right away, that kind of flags it as maybe something you should be aware of. Maybe it's not a problem, but if that sounds like a lot of generated content, maybe that's causing your metrics to get skewed. Here's an experiment that we offer where it can mimic pre-rendered HTML. And what this does is, it cheats. It's not really, reorganizing their server architecture to actually deliver HTML, but instead we save the final state of the DOM and stash it somewhere on a static server. And then we rerun the test, and this experiment actually serves that last state of the DOM as if it was coming from the server from the start. And in the case of Airbnb, that means that instead of divs that are colored with a background of gray, there are real images in the page that the browser can actually discover and say, oh, I need to go fetch these, right away, which is how browsers are optimized to behave. So if I were to run that one, and I did earlier tonight, here we are. So we have LCP is now almost 5 seconds faster. And you can see here at 3 seconds, we're already seeing images come in. This one's still coming up on 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds, right? So that was pretty comparable to the original run. So the control looks accurate. But in this case, if we look at the timeline here, at 3 seconds, we're getting our first image at LCP versus much later. Now, I want a huge caveat. I'm not suggesting that they built their architecture in a way that doesn't serve them well. But if their team was considering, the benefits of potentially trying to serve HTML more meaningfully up front, something like this could tell them in a matter of minutes if it would be worth their effort. Because doing that actual work would take, I don't know, 6 months, something like, probably longer. So it's interesting. Okay, I'll show one more example. I wanted to profile this page.
No longer work for me.
Yeah, well, I was curious what it would find. This tool is kind of like playing video games for me now. I just run sites through it, see what it finds. So in this case, let's see, it was, I'll go to the opportunities. Oh yeah, so it had a slightly later LCP. I think it was orange, and it was like close to 4 seconds, something like that. So if I scroll down to the opportunities for, initial quickness, the first one that it recommends is, again, defer render blocking scripts, and it only has one in there. So to me, right away, that seems like a pretty clean experiment to run, because if it has like 20 or so, a lot of times some of those are probably needed to be render blocking, and you'll have to uncheck a few, and you kind of need to know the code base really well. But I thought, okay, if LCP is late, then I like to start with something like this that blocks the earlier metrics, because they're so additive, right? Like, to get to LCP, you have to get to FCP first and initial render. And if initial render was late, let's fix that one first. Maybe it fixes the later ones as well. So I ran, actually, I'll just run this one live. And I'm just gonna, I'll just run it live. And while that one runs, I wanted to show one more section of the opportunities page that I think is pretty neat. So ran a test on the New York Times homepage earlier, mobile layout, I believe. So it was like more like this view. Yeah, that. And this, there it is. Slow refresh rate. This is the test run of that. So for this one, I wanted a page with a sizable headline that we could run an experiment on, just to show some of the power of the custom experiments. So if you scroll down in the opportunities page, past quick, past usable, past resilient, you get to this section at the bottom called Create Experiments. Here we go. All right. And it's collapsed by default. But if you spin it open, this is kind of like the power tools section. A lot of performance auditors in the room. I know if I were looking at this, I would think, is this kind of doing the job that I do day to day? Like all these, little experiments that I'm used to doing that manually, what's going on? I'm in the same camp, right? And what we wanted to do was make some of these common optimizations and experiments more accessible to anyone on team, to be able to diagnose a problem and maybe tell their engineers what might help fix that problem, while still giving the power tools to the people who are used to using these tools day to day, and make it more efficient. You can run more experiments and test more things now. So if you look through this section, there's some really cool things. Arbitrarily, you can just add HTML to the site as it passes through. So you could add HTML to the start of the head, the end of the head, end of the body. Picture you wanted to add like a chat widget or a reviews script or something to your site, and you wanted to know the impact of the performance of that script before you put it live. You could test that here and just see if performance regresses by adding that script to the end of your head tag, for example. There are others like find and replace text. This is optionally with regular expressions, pretty powerful. It runs against the text of the HTML itself. So we're not just talking about replacing like the text in a heading, but you could be, finding all the H1s in a page and change them to H2s or, whatever, add an attribute. It's very free form. So wherever the other more specific specialized optimizations might fall short, you have that very manual option. And then there are all these others that are just like, the same ones that you see recommended up top with specific URLs, except just open-ended. Like I want to defer some render blocking scripts. I can check that box, say I want to run that one, and then I could say any scripts that contain site.js in their source attribute would get a defer attribute. So that's kind of how those work. I wanted to just demo a find and replace on the New York Times. So that's this test result. So I'm gonna just grab this heading, show you how it works. And hopefully there's no Unicode or anything, or surprises in there, but what's a fun heading? Meetup. Went great. Yeah. All right. And I'm going to run just one experiment run just to see if it works. I don't need many. If you're running an experiment, it's useful to keep an eye on that box, just because with 2 runs, a control and an experiment for every experiment that you run, they can add up, especially if you had like 9 test runs and first view and repeat view all selected, you could have like 50 test runs by running an experiment. So it's good that you have that control. All right, so let's just see if that other test finished. Yes, okay. So this was defer that one render blocking script, and this is on 4G. So fast connection, and we've got a 1.5 seconds, LCP, first contentful paint sooner. So just by getting their one script.js out of the way, that seems like a useful thing to consider if you were working on that site. So I'll let this one run while we take questions, and we can see if the heading swapped out.
Are you planning on implementing something like tree shaking, for example, like to split CSS and critical and non-critical?
That's a great question. Yeah. So we have a lot of issues in the tracker for experiments and opportunities to add. Optimizing scripts is a huge, I think, we don't cover that area very well yet. And I think that would be definitely a cool one to add several experiments for. So yeah, I mean, we have a ticket for it. It's in the works. Yeah.
One more, just one more. I'm sorry. Are you planning on doing something like JavaScript aggregation? Maybe like instead of deferring, combining.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that kind of sounds along the same lines of, like maybe these scripts should be combined. Maybe, minification isn't on, all those sorts of things. I think, yeah, for scripts, we have a lot of opportunities. Hey, look, the meetup went well. Yeah, so obviously not very useful. Experiment there, unless you just want the depressing headlines. Exactly. And I thought it would be faster with less text, but yeah, it's all worse. Yeah, optimizing JavaScript, definitely. Things like responsive images, we don't really have a lot of coverage for yet. Like this image is not using picture or source set, but it should.
Or unused.
Yes, yeah, stuff like that.
Are you planning to have an ability to control the time? So if you want to test if a script will load like slower, I guess, or faster, I don't know if you are caching it in the Netlify CDN, where you can deliver it quicker or.
Okay, yeah, so like if it's not on a CDN,
Right.
And you know, how much would it speed it up? Yeah, we have some of that already. I wasn't able to like show every opportunities, but we do have, for example, self-host. You know, it'll say you have several fonts that are hosted on a third-party server. What happens if you self-host them? Well, you can check that box and see. So there are things like that. The CDN one is kind of difficult because really every experiment, as long as you know the script you're talking about is on your server, it's kind of going through a CDN when we run the proxy. So that kind of comes as part of the experiment anyway, and we should probably note that a little more clearly.
Yeah, I think the case is more slowing things down.
Yeah, so that's a great point. There are a couple, the resilient section at the bottom of the opportunities. Some of those experiments that it recommends down there are purposefully about testing whether your site would break in certain scenarios instead of whether something would help. So you can make scripts fail either immediately or hang indefinitely. Like say your CDN provider it has an outage and it's hanging, right? What would happen? Does your site go down, or are you built in such a way that it's, you know, resilient to handle that condition? So you can test those things.
And another thing, the recipes kind of like experiments that you guys been adding. Is the plan to continuously add that, or
Yeah.
Can I create my own recipes? For
Both.
example?
Yeah. I think, you know, the arbitrarily change HTML kind of experiments would go a long way towards, you know, if say there's a new link rel attribute that comes out and we don't have an experiment for it yet, you could write your own using that. So in some ways it's open-ended down there, and you could write your own. Yeah.
So when you run experiment, it's one control and one experiment, or so you
Per run. Yeah.
Okay, and do you have the ability to like say like I want to do a larger sample, I want to do 20 and 20 or something like that?
Totally. Yeah. I think the limit, is there a limit of 9 runs? Yeah. So you would get 9 experiments and 9 control runs. And then if you did first and repeat views, like to see how your site works, if you refresh it for caching, you would get a multiple more of that. But yeah, 9 is the max, at least, that we have set for now. It'll just use whatever test runs you happen to start with. So if you like ran a web page test run with 9 runs, the experiments will pre-fill that you're going to run 9 experiments. And you can knock it down if you want, or keep it.
And so can you also like say, here's some URL, can I just block that resource out? Like can I just block any network resource or something like that?
Yeah. So there are a few different parts in the opportunities page that'll either recommend that to you. Like, for example, these scripts are blocking the main thread for 4 seconds. Here's an experiment that you could try that blocks those scripts from loading at all, or blocks that whole domain, or makes that domain hang. You know, things like that you can do from there.
Thank you.
So building on the previous question, can you combine experiments and run like
Yeah.
you have checkboxes there?
Yes.
Right? Is it spin up separate experiments? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up because I should have mentioned it earlier. So often it makes sense, probably more often it makes sense to run experiments in isolation.
Right.
And that's just so when you see an improvement or a degradation, you can be pretty sure that it's it's correlated to the thing that you ran instead of one of many. That said, sometimes it makes sense to pair up 2 or 3 that complement one another. It's hard to say off the top of my head which those are, but if you were to inline a couple CSS files and async load the rest of them, that's a pretty common pattern to get the CSS out of the critical path. You'd want to run two experiments to do that. So sometimes it makes sense. Yeah, whatever you do when you hit go, it's one experiment run that applies all of the checkboxes. Yeah.
And the second question, you mentioned regular expressions.
Yeah.
Is that the only way to, or you also support XPath and CSS?
No, yeah, so it's just, at least what we offer there is just a dumb find and replace. But you can do regular expressions if you want to. It's not on by default.
No, I'm not saying by default, but can you use instead of regular expression X?
Not currently, but that's a good idea.
Are you planning on saving experiments or you can already save them? Because if you logged in, you can save your history.
Yeah,
Browse, but-
right. So for now, there's the test history page whenever this loads, where you can see all of the tests you ran. And if you're familiar with test history, this has not really been redesigned along with all these new features, but there is an issue that shows what this is going to look like very soon. And it's going to be a lot easier because these are all test runs that some say they're an experiment, some say they're a control, some are original test. But in the redesign, it'll be all original tests and then a column for, oh, this test had several experiments paired with it. And you can see what those were.
Just one more.
Yeah.
So right now you have some features and options in previous web page tests, like for example, you can exclude, you can write script, you can exclude some script.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit kind of distributed throughout the application.
Mhm.
Are you planning on like redesigning it to combine this inside the experiments as opposed to having it in all different places?
So are you talking about
Yeah.
in advanced settings, you can script,
Yeah.
for example? Yeah, okay. So the way experiments run is they actually use this custom script tab. If you've ever used it before, it's a way to procedurally, you could make many steps, for example, in a test, like go to this, navigate to this page, focus on this particular input, set the value to this, then hit submit and log in, for example, and then see the end performance of that series of steps. Sort of like that. That's what we do with experiments, except we're setting the host to our proxy, and it goes through that, and you get the proxied version of the site instead. Long story short, some settings that are scripted are preserved if you run an experiment on them, and some are not. Some, like if I go to advanced here, custom headers, like if you set a custom header, that'll keep preserved.
Right.
Also off, so like basic login, if you're trying to test a site that needs login,
Yeah.
that'll be preserved too.
Mhm.
So yeah, some are wiped out. We're working on making more not wiped out.
Amazing job.
Is anyone? Yeah.
Comment, when the test results first come, just want to congratulate the designer who came up with the not bad comment, which is absolutely driving me insane every time. It means we click to look at it. I put the heading, call my work not bad. So it's a good job of
Okay.
people just
Yeah.
versus saying, oh, good job. It's like, I don't need to.
The team thought about that a lot. So some tools sort of present you with a grade, right? And Lighthouse sort of famously does, right? And I think that's really useful for what you're trying to do with Lighthouse. What we're hoping this tool presents is sort of an alternative where it's opportunities to do better that you can decide if they're important to you or not, but it's sort of giving you more information, and it's definitely not a pass or a fail. Like the goal is not necessarily to get all green on this tool, but to find scenarios where you're not getting all green.
Well, I think you did a great job there.
Okay,
So I mean,
thanks.
it made me click,
Yeah,
made me look, and made me learn stuff. So
cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, we had that debate over the life of WebPageTest, whatever the grades, scores, or anything,
Yeah.
the right grades. Basically, since day one, I would say
Right.
when we had that. So
Right.
It's a chill. It's a chill.
one more quick question.
Yeah.
At sometimes during the day, in particular of European servers, there's thousands of tests running.
Mhm.
What is going on?
We have a lot of users in certain parts of the world that are running a lot of tests. We're working on making that better. There's auto scaling on a lot of the locations. Some don't have it quite as ramped up as others. So they will
Is it
soon.
really legitimate users or is this hackers trying to?
It's legitimate users now.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Did you want to add to that, Gina?
You said no. We also have when people notice it, they actually go up on Twitter or on GitHub issues, and that's when the team gets in and puts a little bit more scaling.
I will recall that you guys like, there's a denial of service attack going on against somebody, they're misusing your stuff.
Yeah, no, it's real tests being run. We recently introduced caps, so to speak, that go along with the different plan levels. And as part of that, I think people will run fewer thousands of tests at a time, hopefully. But, yeah.
Just to add to that, a few years ago, somebody published a spreadsheet that's utilized WebPageTest
Yeah,
API.
Andy gave
You can
these,
spin
right?
up thousands of those tests, and that's what
Sure.
produces that
Okay.
Yeah.
magnitude. What I really liked recently running WebPageTest is that it says like, oh, you're behind this really low number. A minute later, it's like, oh, your test is running. So I'm not sure what happened there. Either those tests were canceled, but
Yeah,
it was a very pleasant experience compared to a few years ago where sometimes mobile tests, especially on mobile devices in the lab, they would get stuck and they would not run for hours.
yeah, yeah.
But you can just forget about them, and your best bet was to retry to
Right. Yeah. Well, it's good to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, the team's been working really hard on auto scaling those locations. The
Real
fuel,
devices though?
they're Amazon servers throughout the world for the most part.
Mobile devices.
Yeah, it varies. A lot are Linux devices. We also have iOS simulators, things like that. But
The other thing, since you're using your own scripting a lot, it would be great if the documentation of the scripting could be a little bit refreshed.
I think so. Yeah.
This is like really like a dark magic almost to get the scripts right.
Yeah. And there is this page you're talking about, right? To run scripting. Yeah. In the future, I think we would like more of a UI around scripting tests where it's like, you know, you can just sort of select from a select menu the various things. Do you want to navigate? Do you want to add a cookie? You know, those sorts of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott.